Good evening. My name's Susan Cobb. I'm the director of the junior school here at MBA and want to extend a very warm welcome to you to tonight's Trinity Forum conversation with Malcolm Guite. It is a privilege for MBA to host the event this evening and with our partnership with St. Paul Christian Academy. And just so exciting, honestly, to see such a great crowd and was hearing how many people traveled from a fairly good distance to hear from Malcolm. So it's fun to see his fan club here in the Southeast gather together. I know they're excited to hear from you. So I would like to welcome Cherie Harder, who is the president of Trinity Forum, up to the podium to introduce tonight's speaker.
Well, thank you so much, Susan, and welcome to all of you joining us for tonight's online evening conversation with Malcolm Guite on an epic for our times. We are so glad to be here once again. This is actually our 12th year in partnership with MBA and St. Paul. And we just so appreciate the vision, the collegiality. This has been such a rewarding as well as enjoyable partnership, and just really appreciate the leadership of Will Norton and Susan, as well as William Daughtry at MBA. As we start out, I'd like to thank not only our partners, but also our sponsors who've made tonight possible, including the firm of Sims Funk, the Cheris Foundation, David and Janet Chestnut, Kevin and Jessica Douglas, David and Ashley Edwards, John and Laura Foster, Bill and Elizabeth Hawkins, Michael and Sarah Ruth Hendricks, Ken and Donna McElrath, Eric and Eleanor Osborne, Ed and Molly Powell, Clay and Amy Richards, Giff and Anna Thornton, Chris and Eleanor Wells, as well as a couple of anonymous donors. That's a long list, but it takes a village to make tonight possible. So hearty thanks to all of you. I'd also, yeah. I'd also like to send a special welcome to those of you who are here for the very first time, as well as Susan mentioned, several of you have traveled many hundreds of miles from out of state. So thank you for the honor of your time and attention. And if you are one of those new people or are otherwise new to the work of the Trinity Forum, part of our mission at the Forum is to cultivate, curate, and disseminate the best of Christian thought, and to provide a place where leaders can wrestle with the big questions of life in the context of faith, and ultimately to come to better know the author of the answers. And part of the way we pursue that mission is by offering conversations and engagement with some of the most thoughtful scholars, artists, and leaders on ideas of enduring significance to help connect timeless wisdom with timely issues. Our guest tonight is a poet, scholar, and songwriter who is well known for weaving together artistry and erudition, the ancient and the current, in sonnets, songs, and scholarship that invite reconsideration of the importance of the imagination in understanding and appreciating the world. Tonight, he's going to draw upon his forthcoming and ambitious new work, Merlin's Isle and Arthuriad, a 4-volume epic poem that retells the stories of the quest, battles, and adventures of King Arthur and the knights of the Round Table. And if you're sitting here and thinking you can't imagine what relevance King Arthur might have for today, or wonder what the point of a retelling might be, well, our guest tonight might respond that imagination and wonder is exactly the point. In his reflections on Merlin's Isle, he reminds us that imagination is not escapism, but a way of knowing and loving the world. At a time when we're bombarded with a dizzying onslaught of misinformation, propaganda, algorithmically driven outrage, and customized information streams, it can become all too easy to be inured to a sense of confusion or meaninglessness, or to mistake cynicism for reality. An encounter with old stories can offer wisdom and perspective to better understand where we are and orient us to the journey ahead. Our guest tonight has written, "Unless we read old books and stories, we have no access to other ways of seeing and knowing." Our guest tonight is one of those rare guides who invites us to see our own fractured time in light of a mythic past and to glimpse the ways in which old tales can orient our hearts towards hope. Malcolm Guite is a renowned and beloved poet, priest, songwriter, and scholar who's been described as what you might get if John Donne journeyed to Middle Earth, taking musical cues from Jerry Garcia and fashion tips from Gandalf. He is, I am very proud to say, a senior fellow of the Trinity Forum, as well as a life fellow of Girton College at Cambridge University, and where he has served for more than 20 years as chaplain there, as well as teaching at the Faculty of Divinity and lecturing widely across North America. He's the 2023 winner of the Lanfranc Award for Education and Scholarship, a singer-songwriter with the band Mystery Train, and a remarkably prolific author and poet who writes the weekly column Poet's Corner, as well as over a dozen books spanning works of poetry, criticism, and anthologies, a list that's too long to go through. But I will mention that his forthcoming work, Merlin's Isle, which is published by The Rabbit Room, a 4-volume epic poem on the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, the first volume of which will be released this March, entitled Galahad and the Grail. Be on the lookout for sure. After Malcolm provides keynote remarks, St. Paul headmaster Will Norton will pose the first question, and then we'll moderate questions from the audience. Malcolm, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Can I just first say, I mean, it was very encouraging and wonderful introduction. It's all downhill from here, but how encouraged I am that you're all here. We live in a time when poetry itself has become marginalized and fractured. And, some people would hear the word poetry and go, oh no. I'm addressing a large group, and I'm not sure how many of them are into poetry or not. I sometimes feel I have to perform a minor exorcism. Because sometimes, particularly this is for guys, people think, oh, poetry's not for me, or I don't get it, or, And usually that's because somewhere resting on the margins of your mind is the unlisted shade of a bad English teacher who told you couldn't do it. Who told you that your first trembling in kind of what this poem meant to you, and she goes, that's wrong, and then the teacher's pet has the right answer. The kind of teacher whom your own wonderful poet Billy Collins, the poet laureate of Texas, described as the idea of that bad English lesson. She says her idea of doing poetry was to tie the poem to a chair and beat it with a hose pipe till it confessed what it meant. But by contrast, he says, I wanted to put my ear up to the murmuring hive of the poem and wonder what music, what honey the innumerable bees of its words were making. Very different. So the great Nobel laureate Seamus Heaney said that at its best, perhaps, poetry offers phrases that feed the soul. And maybe, that's just what you'll get tonight, is some phrases that feed the soul. So I'm amazed that you've come for a talk on poetry. Hooray. And then it's a talk on epic poetry and on the making of a new epic. This is, as I explained to the publishers when I was looking at this, I'm so glad that Rabbit Room took this on, and they're just doing an amazing job. I mean, here tonight is Stephen Krotz. He was on my rider. I said, I'll do this poem with you as long as I get Stephen Krotz as my illustrator. And, there he is. He's going to do amazing things. You'll see that. But they've really run with it. But when I was first pitching it, I said, they always say when you pitch things, you have to have what they believe is called the USP, which is the unique selling point. So I said, well, nobody has tried to do anything like this for 150 years. that Tennyson was the last guy who managed to retell the story, you know, and read, well, there are one or two exceptions, but epic. But then I had to point out that the unique selling point might also be the unique sinking point, because, you know, there might be a reason why I never wanted to do that. But I had a hunch that the time was coming. I had a hunch that the more we get this dwindled, twittering soundbite, this temporary, brief, faked AI flicker across our screens, the more we were in a world where, when a young person buys a brand new phone, the software is obsolete before they've even taken it home. The first thing you have to do is update it. That there might be a hunger for the things that last, that there might be a yearning for something of permanence and beauty in the midst, and that one, you know, one of the great tales, the formative tales, the tales that in our telling of them retell us, there might be a time and a place for that. So anyway, I've always loved these stories since my mother told them to me, and you know, I just felt the time was come again. I'm going to just read you now, if I may, a few passages from the appendix from the first volume, in which I set out what I was trying to do and why, and, you know, give you some other backgrounds. So I've loved these stories since I was a child and heard them from my mother, who was a great storyteller herself, but also had extensive knowledge of the medieval sources, especially the great gathering of those stories and their rendering into Middle English by Sir Thomas Malory in the 15th century. So the stories that first moved me were not some sanitized Hollywood version, but the real thing, haunting, numinous, continually suggestive of the holy and beautiful reality of God and his saints and angels, shimmering through the fabric of the stories of the knights, with all their aspirations and all their human flaws. At the heart of those early versions of the stories is the Holy Grail itself, the presence of Christ and his gospel, moving as an unbearably beautiful light through the mists and magic of pre-Christian Celtic Britain, drawing even the wizards and the fairy folk towards himself, baptizing the imagination of our ancestors, fulfilling and disclosing the true meaning of their earliest stories. As a student at Cambridge, I rediscovered these stories in their original sources, and I became aware of how so many modern versions of them seem to marginalize or even completely erase the deep Christian impulse that had formed their original telling. And as a poet, I long to restore that lost element in the hope of a new telling that might baptize the imagination of the growing generation brought up in a secular world, trapped in the immanent frame and deprived of their inheritance in the gospel. Let me cut to the chase on this, and I will confess the real ambition I have here. Many of you may know the extraordinary story that C.S. Lewis tells about himself in Surprised by Joy. He looks back to his ardently atheist, slightly awkward, ludicrously precocious 16-year-old self, going off to be tutored to get ready for Oxford or Cambridge by the great Knock. And now he's randomly browsing a bookstall at the station at Bookham. And he sees a novel by George MacDonald called Fantastes. And he says, I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. And he gradually opens these stories, and he encounters, though he doesn't even know a name for it then, not simply beauty or strangeness or haunting myth, but holiness. And he says it was like a kind of bright shadow, like a light. It seemed to enchant even the trees in the woods as he passed in the railway. And he said he crossed over a border, and he says in some way his imagination was baptized in that reading. In fact, you might say that the whole plot of Surprised by Joy, the shape of my early life, is how he's based this. You could summarize that book by saying, my imagination was baptized before I was, and the rest of me just took a bit longer to catch up. Somehow, and let me confess, I would like to write a book which maybe after I'm dead is picked up by some random teenager, in a jumble sale, who happens to be the next C.S. Lewis, and that I might have a hand in baptizing an imagination that would then go out as his did and kindle so many imaginations, minds including, for Christ. So the love of the stories is there. But let me go back to something I said in the appendix before we get into a little bit of the stories themselves. I'm trying to recover a sense of the numinous. I'm trying to lift the veil to see, not so much to re-enchant as to undisenchant the world, to help us see what is already there. And of course, I'm influenced by many. It's amazing how many of the Inklings, but Lewis, Tolkien, Charles Williams, Owen Barfield, all loved the Arthurian stories, all touched on them in different ways, Williams more than most, but Lewis too. And there's a very interesting passage, and here I speak to, I hope my book will be widely read and enjoyed in America, and I think the stories of Arthur are a common heritage for all the English-speaking peoples wherever they are, and indeed the Welsh and Latin-speaking peoples. But they are peculiar to our islands. They are almost the very story the land holds. And I am trying, at least to contribute to the reawakening of my own nation to its true vocation, to remembering the things that it's forgotten. So if I may, I'll read you a passage which comes not from me, but from C.S. Lewis's That Hideous Strength, when at the end of the novel, when, as it were, Merlin has been revived, the evil has been averted, the new Pendragon who is there, and they're sort of celebrating, and they're thinking about the meaning of what they've just done. And Lewis writes through one of his characters in the story, something we may call Britain is always haunted by something we may call Logres. So Logres is the old Welsh name for the kingdom of Arthur. Something we may call Britain is always haunted by something we may call Logres. Haven't you noticed? We are two countries. After every Arthur, a Mordred. Behind every Milton, a Cromwell. A nation of poets, a nation of shopkeepers. Don't you feel it? The very quality of England. If we've got an ass's head, it was by walking in a fairy wood. So brilliant, that. If we got an ass's head, it was by walking in a fairy wood. Now, here's the thing. We've heard something better than we can do. I can't quite forget it. Don't you see it in everything English? A kind of awkward grace, a humble, humorous incompleteness. We've heard something better than we can do. I think that's true of the vocation of every nation. You might like to consider it in the vocation of the states. I make no further comment. That you've heard something you might be in danger of forgetting about liberty. I won't get it. It's not for me. But I certainly say for England, we've heard something that's better than we can do. But let's be honest, that's not just true of any nation. It's not true of every one of us who's heard the gospel. It's not just that we've come to know Christ as our Savior, and that's a wonderful thing, but okay, like Christ is my Savior, now what? He's shown me the glimmerings of his kingdom. He's showed me a whole new way of seeing. He's told me that one day the veil will be lifted, that God's kingdom will come on earth, his will be done, and that, we'll suddenly see everybody. If Solomon, the wayside weed is Solomon arrayed in all his glory, how much more he will hear you. We're going to see a glory and a splendor in one another. And we somehow have to live by that vision. But we've heard something that's better than we can do. And we keep falling away from what we've heard and needing to be reminded of it. And one of the things that these great stories that come out of the baptized imagination of a nation earlier remind us of that. So that passage I've just quoted, I write in my prologue, I say this, I remembered this passage, that thing about the good haunting, about my nation needs to remember, Britain needs to remember Logres, okay? I remember this passage when, at the death of Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth, Britain suddenly remembered herself, remembered why we have the hallowed Abbey of Westminster, why we have the beautiful symbolic rituals and gestures of immemorial tradition in church and state. People who had been told they only had an attention span of 5 minutes, queued for days to walk out of a noisy world and in awestruck silence stand and genuflect in the ancient chamber where Her Majesty lay, with a guard of honor, with bright swords, with the fabled beauty of the crown resting on her coffin, laid aside for the greater glories of heaven. It felt like a kind of national awakening, a national remembering of the true Christian kingdom of Logres that always haunts modern Britain, and it filled me with hope that I might make a poem that would reach down to that root, rekindle that memory, and awaken us even further. So, folks, that's what I'm trying to do. And as you can imagine, it's no mean undertaking. I mean, the thing, I have confessed it, the thing I'm Mr. Sonnet. I'm known for the sonnet. I published 2 sonnet sequences that have fortunately done well, and I figured out how to do that. And, I know, and the great thing about the sonnet is a lovely contract between the writer and the reader, because you start by saying, look, don't worry, it's only gonna last 14 lines. I promise you, we'll get to the end. And of course, we're writing towards that 14th line, and you play all kinds of games. So I can do that. And I've got to the point where I can write a sonnet in a hotel lobby, but I can't write an epic in a hotel lobby. I've had to go back to the beginning. I've had to learn new skills. I've had to soak myself in the epics of the past. But it's been a great and exciting adventure in the sense I feel rather like, I don't know if you noticed that when Gandalf calls on first Bilbo and then later Frodo, they're not young whippersnappers. They're just about to set into the other end of comfortable middle age when they're suddenly called away from their hobbit holes. And I feel I'm being called away well past middle age into an epic adventure. So it took a bit of gearing up towards. And I kept on saying to myself, I can't do it now because I don't have the exact form. I can't do it now. Now's not the right time. And then the Rabbit Room sent me a thing asking me if I would write a brief Galahad story for another book that they were doing. And I decided to do that. And I suddenly found that the form I could use was the ballad form. It was staring me in the face. I just spent 4 years doing an in-depth study of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and written a book called Mariner, A Voyage with Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It was staring me in the face. So I wrote this ballad story, and it just was like the pebble that loosed the avalanche. I suddenly realized I could do it. I'd found the form. But it was still daunting. So I went out for a walk one morning to kind of have a few words with my muse and see if she and I were up for this. And what turned out that it wasn't so much my having a few words with her as her having some fairly severe words with me, to the end of stop procrastinating and get on with it. So that became the prelude poem, the proem, as it were, which I'm going to read you now, which will appear at the beginning of each of the 4 volumes, and is my marching orders, as it were, to do this thing and why I'm doing it. And you'll see as I read this that I am riffing on that very passage I read you from That Hideous Strength about Britain and Logres. But you'll also see, I hope, some of what I'm trying to do in terms of suddenly busting us out of this reductivism, this nothing buttery, this idea that, everything is explicable in terms of the mere random concatenation of atoms. You know that stuff? You're nothing but the unwinding of enzymes or the self-replication of a selfish gene, or, I mean, those things are physically there and they're marvelous and mysteries in themselves, but you're way more than that. Lewis put his finger on this very, very well. I don't know if you remember in Voyage of the Dawn Treasure, where in that world, a star, a resplendent, luminous body of the heavenly things taking part in the great dance, is able to become a human form and speaks to us. So Eustace, who's the kind of, ship skeptic, is introduced to this guy. So he's a star. I mean, not a star like you have a star in Nashville, yeah, but a star, an actual heavenly. And Eustace says, well, in our world, a star is just a ball of flaming gas exploding into the infinite vacuity of space. And the guy who is a star says, Eustace, even in your world, that's not what a star is. It's just what it's made of. To put that in the hands of a child, the distinction between you are so much more than what you're made of. Just to know that. Anyway, so I'm trying to restore that. So here is the prelude, and it's called Take Up a Tale. And it'll give you an idea of the kind of form and meter I'm working with. As I walked out one morning, all in the soft, fine rain, it seemed as though a silver veil was shining over hill and vale, as though some lovely long-lost spell had made all new again. And through that shimmer in the air, I seemed to hear a sound, as though a distant horn were blown in some lost land that I had known, that seemed to speak from tree and stone and echo all around. And with the music came these words, Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale this land still keeps. In earth and water magic sleeps. The dryad sighs, the naiad weeps, but you can lift the veil. From where the waves wash Cornwall's caves, out to the White Horse Vale, this land still holds the tale of old. Like hidden treasure, buried gold, once more the story must be told. Poet, take up the tale. Take up the tale of courtesy. Take up the tale of grace. Revive the land's long memory. Summon the fair folk, let them be. Something of fairy, wild and free, still lingers in this place. Lift up your eyes to see the light on Glastonbury Tor. Then come down from that far green hill to where the sacred waters spill and shine within the chalice well, and listen to their lore. Yea, listen well before you start. Be still ere you begin. Though modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. See through the surface round about, the noise, the rush, the fear, the doubt. Though modern Britain lies without, fair Logres lives within. You may yet walk through Merlin's isle, by oak and ash and thorn. The ancient hills do not forget, and you might wake their wisdom yet. Who knows what wonders might be met on this midsummer morn? So, I have taken up the tale to tell it full and free, the tale that makes my heart rejoice. I tell it, for I have no choice. I tell it till another voice takes up the tale from me. So that sense that we're part of a long tradition. Thank you. I mean, So as I come towards the end of my time, and we're going to have lots of time for open discussion and so on. That's fine. I just want to kind of confront something head on. I'm a priest and a poet, but some people say, well, why do you have to story? What's all these stories of Arthur and Merlin and everybody to do with? Can't you just tell them the gospel straight and pure? And here's Jesus. Here's what he did for you. This is a transaction. You can. And let me first say, there is definitely a place for that. I know people who can share the gospel in 5 minutes on a street corner and change people's lives. And I say hallelujah and prayers to them. But I also know how long it took me to come back. And I know how it was the opening of the eyes of my imagination first. That it was sheer beauty and poetry that made me realize I wasn't just the unwinding of a selfish gene. I had experiences of beauty and art that I realized that undid the mere dogmatic materialism that I espoused at that time, because there was an abundance, an overplus, a moreness, a mystery just in the art. It was John Keats's Ode to a Nightingale that did that for me. Now, Keats is not a Christian poet, nor is the Ode to Nightingale a Christian poem. But when I read it as a homesick boy standing in Keats's house as a 16-year-old, I was so moved by it. And suddenly, out of nowhere, not explicitly, not as a proof text, the biblical figure of Ruth appeared. And he imagined Ruth hearing the same nightingale that he was hearing. When sick for home, she stood in tears amidst the alien corn. And I suddenly realized how homesick I was for home, for actual home. But also inside that, homesick for something more. I had what Lewis called the yearning for the far-off country. Now, of course, I needed more. And I went up to Cambridge and I studied English literature, and it's partly through reading literature that I became a Christian again. And like my story is very similar to Lewis's in that, you know, my imagination was baptized before I was. The rest of me took a bit longer. Now, there was definitely a place for the reading and opening of scriptures. There was definitely a place for a mentor to sit me down and say, you can't go on like this, Guide. You're going to have to make a decision. There was all of that. But to get me even to the place where I could begin to think that made sense, there was all the ruins of beauty. There was all the kindling of my imagination. And there was the realization that there was divine wisdom even in these apparently pagan stories. But in fact, more than that, of course, because the astonishing thing about the Arthuriad is that it gathers together stories which are clearly pre-Christian. I mean, there are druids, there are ladies of the lake, you know, there are all kinds of, there's a Green Knight, you know? And yet, Merlin the druid is having a conversation in the stories with the Archbishop of Canterbury about how Arthur can become king. Now, there was a fashion at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century when scholars looked at this as both Christian and pagan. Because they were all anti-Christian, it was the beginning of the aggressive secularism of the 20th century. They said, oh, no, they're really pagan with just a light Christian gloss. You know, the chalice isn't really the chalice of the Last Supper and the gift of Christ himself to the world. It's the old pagan cauldron of generation where you could put stuff in and it would come out as plenty. But of course, they were living in a Christian age, so they had to paint this little light Christian gloss on it. So the fashion was to scrape the Christian gloss off and say they're really pagan stories. But frankly, that weren't where. The more you read the original text, the more you see how deeply and thoughtfully Christian they are. And yet they had room for the old stories. So the scholar who really got this was, in fact, Charles Williams, the great friend of C.S. Lewis. And had he lived, he would have published a book called The Figure of Arthur. But he died before it was finished. But Lewis published it in an extremely rare book that has never been called an Arthurian Torso, in which he gives you what Williams was saying. And Williams has been very much one of my guides in writing this. And Williams says the real nature of between the pagan and the clearly Christian in the telling of these great stories is not essentially pagan with a later added Christian gloss. On the contrary, the Christians chose to remember and baptize the pagan for a reason. And he takes you to Acts 17 and Paul said, observing the statues, and he said, men of Athens, I see in every way you are very religious. As I observed the objects of your worship, I saw this statue to an unknown God. Him, therefore, whom you worship as an unknown, him I preach. Now, that didn't mean he was saying, fine, so groove on down to Apollo, you know. He's saying the God who made the cosmos doesn't live in marble blocks. But you were onto something. There is a story that makes sense of all the stories you've ever loved. There is a God who brings to perfection all the glimmerings whereby he, as Paul says in Romans, he has not left himself without witness that you might feel after and find him. And I came to believe that the beautiful tellings of the Arthur stories were actually an imaginative apologetics and a kind of evangelism to England. That actually they were telling these old Celtic tales and saying, Do you know what that magic cauldron of generation was always about? It was always about the gift of Christ in bread and wine and the Last Supper. Because in those stories, a body is broken and put into a cauldron and comes out alive. They're death and resurrection stories. They had a story about a magical spear that could bring ruin, but also bring great goodness, the spear of Bron. No. It's the spear of Longinus. It's the spear with which we killed our Savior. And yet from his blood comes the blood, from his heart comes the blood and water that redeems us. They were seeing more and more that Christ, and I still feel that there is a place in telling these stories which will actually prepare hearts and minds for the coming of Christ and make sense. But obviously it's been a fashion to do a purely pagan thing for a long time. I was very worried that, I'm going to be in trouble as I do this with the pagan retellers. Those nasty Christians have stolen it back, it's all that stuff. So one of the best and most skillful of those pagan retellers, or pagan in that time, was a guy called Martin Shaw. Anyway, I was kind of road testing this, and I put some bits of it out on my YouTube, and then I got the thing I was dreading. I got this email from Martin Shaw, and he said, "Oh God, boy, I'm in trouble now." He's got this massive neo-pagan Substack following. I'm going. And so he says, "Malcolm, I love what you're doing. Keep doing it." And then he said, "I like the storytelling," which was really nice because I thought that might be my weak point. And he's a great storyteller. It's great, magical neo-pagan storyteller. And then he said, "Come and see me sometime if you're down in Devon." And I went down to see him, and it turned out all kinds of things were moving in his life, bringing him in. And one of the deep symbols in the Arthuriad is the figure of the white hart. This white hart with golden horns, and there's a magical moment where the Grail Knights see the white hart with a hermit and 4 golden lions, and it goes into a chapel and they follow it, and suddenly they see Christ behind the altar, and the 4 lions have become the 4 living creatures around the throne, but also the 4 Gospels. Anyway, so I don't think Martin will mind me telling you this story because he's now become very public with this thing, but I called on him. It was literally a dark and stormy night. The power was out. He was living in this little thatched cottage, completely lit by candles. I sort of thought, I don't know what's going to happen here. So I kind of came with a peace offering of a bottle of single malt whiskey, it's kind of, hold it. And he welcomed me in, and we talked about things and stories. And then he said, he knew perfectly well that I would know the symbolism of the dream. He said, "I've been having a persistent dream. And in this dream, a white hart comes to the door of this cottage and stoops and gets in. And then it somehow with its great antlers, and it comes in and trashes the place." And he said, "Oh, I think it's Christ." It's a bit awkward, really. And we both knew, because we loved the Arthur stories, what this was all about. And I was able to read him a wonderful poem of C.S. Lewis's called "A Cliche Come Out of His Cage," which is about how it's easier to share the gospel with a pagan than it is with a materialist. How somebody had said to Lewis, "The world's going back to paganism." We went, "If only. Like then I would have some material to work with." And that is really happening, believe me. There's a real revival. There's all kinds of people in that way are not just... So anyway, Martin Shaw, when he told me more about this and things that had happened, and I said, "I believe that, Christ is at work in your life, but you need to be sure and you need to pray, but you need to do it your way. You need to know that nothing will be wasted of all the other stuff you've done, all the love you've had for the great myths of the pre-Christian world. God will use all of that. Some of it you'll let go. You'll bring it to the life of Christ, and Christ will say no. But others, you'll go, this is it." So we talked about that. And I said, I was supposed to be leading a retreat at the beginning of Lent. So I said, Lent is a tradition of 40 days preparation for baptism. You need to kind of work on this for 40 days. And if it's right, you'll know and you'll be baptized. And it's exactly what he did. He was baptized, he was received into the Orthodox Church. And I wasn't even a midwife there. I think like the white hart had that well in hand, I was just the random guy that, turned up on the side and gave some encouragement. But it gave enormous encouragement to me that taking this material up and telling it again was something really worth doing. I read to you from the very beginning. I'll stop now because I've already gone 10 minutes over what I was supposed to do, and just read you the very end, which will perhaps, it's not a plot spoiler. Sir Bors has got back after the achievement of the Grail, and he's telling this whole story to the Arthurian court. And Arthur is saying, get the scribes out here and write this down. This story isn't just for this generation. So the tale is not for us alone, but for our children too. So take the tale up if you can and pass it on to maiden man, that it may grow like living grain, both beautiful and true. And that's the end of what Arthur says. And then I bring myself in again. And so the tale came down the years in every land and tongue, and old folk told it through their tears and gave it to the young. And even I, in these dark days, have heard and found it true. So I have taken up the tale and passed it on to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Malcolm. Good evening. My name is Will Norton, and on behalf of the St. Paul community, we're so delighted that you were able to join, and special thanks to Susan Cobb and William Daughtry and Cherie for hosting us, and we're delighted to be here, and what a wonderful inspirational program. I'm going to give the first question. We're going to take other questions, and I think, there's a microphone down here, so we can form the lines. We have 3 rules, the 3 B's: be brief, be civil, and be a question. And so if you'd like to present a question, please feel free to come on down now. My question is, just as institutions, 2 education institutions face artificial intelligence and a horizon that seems to stifle creativity, what advice or disciplines, and as you see that landscape, would you speak into 2 academic institutions?
Oh, wow. How long have you got? So, no, that is a really, really important question in the nature of it. So, first of all, let's just deal with the misnomer in the naming of AI of what those 2 letters stand for. Allegedly, artificial intelligence. Artificial, certainly. However, I don't think the word intelligence is usable at all, because intelligence, as we would understand it, has to have an e-side as well as an outside. It has to have a registering consciousness. Actually, what artificial intelligence is, I mean, it's algorithms and less, but basically it's an averaging interface. That's what it takes a bunch of stuff, and it produces a simulacrum of conscious discourse. But it's not conscious discourse because the great miracle of language, and particularly poetic languages, is that it provides this extraordinary bridge whereby I can, from my heart, from the innerness of my feeling, conscious, unique self, I can make a shape of words such that something of my experience flows over. You receive it, and it speaks into your individual. So it is, as Newman said, and Latin always puts these things much better than English, cor ad cor loquitur, heart speaketh unto heart. Now, AI can never do that because it has no heart, and it never will. Which is why another thing, if I say AI, not artificial intelligence, yes, averaging interface. My third fulfilling of the acronym AI would be abominable invention. Now, that's not true when we use it to figure out how to read medical tests, how to spot the tiny bit of cancer. It can train itself on 1 million MRI images and find that, there's brilliant stuff we can do with it, and there's brilliant minds that are putting it together. But if once we stop getting it to pretend to be human, which is we're already doing, then we're making an idol. And when we make an idol, we dumb down ourselves. You know, hands they have that handle not, eyes they have that see not, ears they have that hear not, you know, tongues they have that speak not. Those who make them shall be like unto them. We're already doing that. With computers, we already talk about people being hardwired for stuff. We use the abominable idea of programming or reprogramming people. We thus eliminate. People are not computers because anything we make is less than we are, by definition. We transcend the things we make. Let's not make ourselves in the image of a thing we've made, because what we lose is the infinite mystery. Every one of your souls is infinitely and inexplicably and inexhaustibly mysterious and known only in its depths to God. And no algorithm is ever going to come close. But a word of hope, okay? I think that AI is going to get so good at faking things that it will make itself redundant. In principle, it'll soon be the case that because deepfake, that anything you encounter online could be faked. You never, however realistic the interview with, the prime minister or the comment with the author or however realistic that interview is, like, you will never be able to verify it. And what that will create is a premium on unique experiences that are unfakeable. And the FOMO, the fear of missing out that's driven people onto internet and websites, will completely reverse the flow. And that will be so cheap, internet to be trash. And people will be able to say, I was at that gig. I was at that church meeting. I was in that classroom. And we were real people, and I learned a real thing from an actual person. And I think the work of a school like this, the work of churches, the work of musicians, the work of artists handing their unique work in a place where that is going to have a real premium. And I think people will forsake the empty and return to the full and fulfilling. So I'm hoping AI will disappear up its own now.
I'll begin with a pretty important question. Which single malt did you bring as a peace offering?
Okay, yeah. Well, I gave it a lot of thought, of course, because it was an Oban 14-year-old. So I could open the conversation with where were we both 14-year-olds when this whiskey began to wait for us, and it was a way of getting him to tell a bit of a story. Yeah, thank you. Yes, it's yeah. Some more folk. Oh, right. Hi.
Hi, are you? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
I recently heard a conversation between an atheist, a Christian, and I guess the third was a psychologist who is somehow neither one of those, but his own category. And they were talking about purpose and meaning, and they couldn't even come up with a shared definition of what they thought what purpose for a human was or for mankind. And so I'm curious, how might you define purpose, and what do you think our purpose is as humans?
Wow. You go for really simple little questions around here. So yeah, no, the clue is in the fact that they couldn't find a shared definition. And that speaks to a fracturedness, and it speaks to a long process that began at the scientific revolution and continued in the Enlightenment of the interiorization or privatization of questions of ultimate value. So supposedly objective truth was only the stuff you could weigh and measure. So you could be certain about that. But everything else which actually makes life worth living, all the things which are qualities rather than quantities, were put into the private terrain here and called subjective. So it was objective, subjective. And then the subjective was just, we can make it up as we go along. Now, that is kind of the opposite of the truth. But because clearly the idea that those subject over here and object over there and never the twain shall meet, and they're two different kinds of truth and two different kinds of knowledge, you can demonstrate almost immediately that this is absurd. Because if you take the prime thing that you know, which is that you exist, your statement, I am, If am is the verb to be, I, subject, am, verb, what am I? I'm me, object. You are the object of your own subjectivity. Everything which is object is also subject in you. And of course, God calls himself I am that I am. So there is a validity and a mutual indwelling between subject and object. So the subject must therefore be able to experience some things that really are objective. There's real truth to be had out there. So let's go back to your not common definition. I think the most awful thing that we visited on the rising generation is the idea that they have to invent meaning and purpose, but they have to invent themselves every day. And maybe a long time ago that felt like a liberation. Hey, I can be anything I want. But actually, it's an intolerable burden. And it's a kind of dread. Because if I keep reinventing myself and finding a new identity, I still don't get as many likes on Facebook as I'd like. So maybe I have to try again. And it's wearing. So it's incredibly good news when you say, do you know, you don't have to invent yourself because somebody else who loves you has already died. You will, from the beginning, the real heart of who you are, deeper and more beautiful than you could ever know, has shimmered in the divine mind since before the beginning of time. And now he's speaking you. You don't have to invent it yourself. You have to just become the beautiful thing that God is right now in the process of making you. I'll give you a historic context for this, right? So there's a story about Coleridge, who was one of my great heroes, and Thomas Clarkson, another hero. Thomas Clarkson began the campaign against slavery, and he recruited William Wilberforce. So Wilberforce is more famous because he was in Parliament and leading it. But Clarkson was the guy that was driving it. He was doing all the research. But that took them year after year, and it kept being rejected. And Clarkson had a bit of a breakdown and not only began his compassion fatigue, but he didn't tell many people, but he was beginning to lose his faith. Not surprising when, every year they presented the manifest injustice of slavery. Every year in the House of Lords, the bench of bishops voted to keep slavery going. Anyway, so his friends sent him to the Lake District and hired a little cottage for him. And happily for him, he bumped into Coleridge one day. And and Coleridge was a massive fanboy of his because Coleridge had campaigned against slavery. But he was surprised to find his great hero, who'd inspired him, was now exhausted and depressed. Of course, as Englishmen, they didn't actually sell any of this stuff to each other at the time. They were living in cottages at the other end of the village, but they wrote each other a letter. So Clarkson writes to Coleridge, and he says, my dear Coleridge, let me confess. And he says, I have no idea anymore of the divine. And Coleridge writes back to me and says, my dear Clarkson, don't worry for now whether you have any idea of the divine, but never forget that you are a divine idea. That, the Lord threw it of Thomas Clarkson, and he wanted to speak Thomas Clarkson into the world for this moment and for this campaign and for this cause. And he has not yet finished saying what he has to say. He said, you and I, Thomas, we are logoi from the logos. We are little words being spoken by the word. And then he said, so let Jesus finish saying what he has to say to the world through you. And he finished up, he says, try not to become an impediment in the speech of Christ. And that's do you see what I mean? It's totally different. If three people saying, I have my idea of meaning, you have your idea of meaning, let's reinvent meaning today, you're going to get nowhere. But if I'm saying, I know God means something by you, and I, to whom you've come, may know more than you do about what God means by you. Let me tell you some of the things that God is saying to me through you. Do you see what a different conversation it would be? So I had that in a poem of my own. I can't remember it all, but it went, I cannot speak unless I have been spoken, nor can I teach unless I have been taught. I cannot break the bread except as I am broken, I'm being uttered. And I think we can offer people, especially people who feel they've got to be the source of meaning every day for themselves, a kind of immense relief, like the job is already taken. But you have the joy of exploring every day, discovering a little more every day of what it is that God is speaking into the world through you. Sorry, long answer to a short question like that.
Thank you so much for sharing with us. Um, I've stood in the queue for so long that I will ask my question, but you've actually already answered it because you're running circles around us all. Thank. Um, oh, a bit ago you mentioned the stories being pagan stories that had some Christian polish put on them,
Yeah.
and we're going back to sort of take uh, reignite the polish or
Yeah. No, I'm saying there was more than polish. I'm saying actually there was something quite Christian in them, but it needed drawing out. Yeah.
right. Well, so my question was just, since God is the author of the answers and the author of the stories themselves, since He is the creator of all, and since even in His Word, every story that we talk about now is imprinted by what He imprinted in the earth. They're just being told over and over, and to know the times of His, or to know that these stories repeat.
Yeah.
That what the pagans have done is to take God's stories and pervert them. And so what we need to do now is manifest the stories as we're being the manifest sons and daughters of God, being revealed that the earth is groaning for. So you've
Yeah, can I speak about that? I think, first of all, we have to be slightly careful about wagging our fingers at the pagans, especially the ones who lived before Christ, as perverting stories. Because if you're going to pervert a story, you have to pervert it from something. You can't pervert something until you know the good thing that it should have been, and then you deliberately bend it or ride from it. Now, it's perfectly possible, and I think this is actually what has happened, that stories which we now see the Christian meaning of are literally being perverted back to something without that meaning. And that's exactly what I'm trying to reverse, by writing this epic. But I still think that these great stories, as they were told, were as they were a preparatio for the gospel. And they were still mediating some goodness and truth. They were terrible. So, and they're often intuitive. So let me give you one of the great themes in the early Arthurian stories, which a lot of the neo-pagans seized on as a classic example of supposedly pagan things, is a theme called the wasteland. So in that you have a king and his land, and the king is the king of the land, and somehow mystically the king and the land are kind of either married or connected. So if all is well with the king, it's well with the land. And in this story, somebody wounds the king. In the case of the Arthurian version of it, it's somebody seizing the very spear that wounded Christ and wounding their host, the king. And as soon as the king is wounded, the land is laid waste. And there's a total barrenness. And we have to wait for a redeeming figure to come, who will come through the wasteland and will heal the king with the very same spear with which the king was wounded. And when the king is healed, the land will be healed, right? Now you could see that's the weird pagan story. And what actually people said, oh, this is a pagan fertility rite. This is about and Jessie Weston, American woman in the 20th, wrote a book From Ritual to Romance, which said exactly that, right? Now I'd say that's a perversion of the story. That story, written by people who did not at that time have formed by orally, not written down, by people who did not at that time have access to the Holy Scriptures. So you can't criticize them for not reading what they've never seen, right? Now, think about the big arc of the great narrative of creation, fall, and redemption, specifically in relation to our relations to nature, right? We sin, we are put in the Garden of Eden to rule. We're kings and queens. a king, because that's what it means to be made in the image of God. The image is, subdue the earth, have dominion over it, right? And the land will flourish because we flourish. And we screw up. And what do we hear? The ground shall be cursed because of you. The poet John Milton made it even clearer. When finally in book 9 of Paradise Lost, we actually get to the action and Eve reaches out and takes the fruit. He doesn't go and so Eve did a private peccadillo and felt rather slightly guilty, as a privatized, buffered individual self. He doesn't say that. The first thing that Milton says is, earth felt the wind. And nature, sighing out through all her works, gave sign that all was lost. And Paul, so nature is suffering because we screwed up. And nature is longing for us. So Paul, totally, all of this in Romans 8, the creation was subjected to futility. And the whole creation waits in eager longing for the revealing of the children of God. Now, if I wanted to put that into an allegorical story, I couldn't do better than the story of the wounded king, the wasteland, and the redemption. And yet I know that story predates the arrival of the Gospels or the scripture to the island of Britain. So far from dismissing it as a perversion, I'm seeing it as a glorious anticipation, whose true meaning I'm now privileged to reveal to the pagan who tells it to me. Hope that helps.
My first instinct is to thank you for the work that you're about to publish in March, and congratulations on that. My concentration at university was Arthuriana, and it led to a career for me as a translator in Welsh.
Wonderful.
And through that particular journey that I've taken, I discovered the poet David Jones.
David Jones,
And Themeton. Now, you mentioned many other influences on you, Lord Charles Taylor and
Charles Williams, yeah. But David Jones is
But David Jones is the most powerful influence, I hope, before I encounter you. And I wonder if you could say something if they could show it with this.
certainly okay. I love David Jones. Anathemata is really important to me, as is in parenthesis, and the extraordinary Arthurian themes going through it. David Jones is the fourth of the great high modernists, and is there with basically James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, maybe Samuel Beckett. So his technique is high modernist. Now, he's great, and you're a scholar of him, and so am I. But I have to say, if you're going to read in parenthesis, it's written in several languages. He uses untranslated Welsh, Greek, It is bristling with footnotes. And it is not like the average teenager is not going to read David. I have to say, I read David Jones as a teenager, but I didn't have video games, So I love Jones. And for a long time, I was actually held back from doing my Arthuriad in all of David Jones and feeling like, oh, I can't do better than that. But also I can't, and eventually it was only when I had a breakthrough and said, David Jones has already done that. That's great. But I'm going to write something in this ringing, swinging ballad form that's going to reach out. However, I'm going to acknowledge David Jones. Let me just quickly, there's so much you could say about David Jones, but David Jones had an actual experience in the First World War, which was kind of converting, which was so strangely parallel to a very important experience in the Arthurian story that he couldn't help but make the fusion and see that these. So he was out gathering wood in no man's land. He enlisted as a private in the First World War. Complete shatter, ruination, the wasteland. Utter devastation. And it's of what was once a French village. But he sees one building. It's a little shack. It's like a barn. It's a little bit of light coming out of it. And he's in there, like the Germans are there or whatever. And he goes up and he sneaks up and he looks, through the crack in the wood. And he sees a fully vested priest lifting the chalice up with 3 or 4 kind of wounded French peasants trying to make Eucharist in the midst of the wasteland. And because he immediately realized this is exactly what happened to Lancelot. in the wasteland, a chapel perilous, that he sees the Grail, but he can't get close to it. And it becomes part of Jones's own conversion to Roman Catholicism. And then he writes this book about the First World War, in which Arthurian things are peeping through. Then he writes a book, Anathemata, which is basically the plot timeline is the celebration of the Eucharist. But all the sections of that and become aeons and era. Like, so in, when the priest is washing his hands and getting ready, he has a whole thing of all the stratas of geological time getting ready for human beings to whom the gospel will come. It's amazing. There is a lot. So he's really good. But I quote him in my epigrams to try and get to what I want from him. So let me read you those. I hope this is in the... this is David Jones in an essay in a book called Art and Sacrament, I think, about what it is one's trying to do as a writer. And I put this first. So I'm not using his style, and I'm not writing in the recherche way that he does. But to conserve, to develop, to bring together, to make significant for the present what the past holds, without dilution or any deleting, but rather by understanding and transubstantiating the material. This is the function of genuine myth, neither pedantic nor popularizing, not indifferent to scholarship nor antiquarian, but saying always, of these thou hast given me, I have lost none. Because they're quoting Jesus. So I honored David Jones, but I'm not writing a new anathema. Yeah.
Good evening, Malcolm. My name is Kevin. I have a question about your book, and if the answer is I have to wait to buy it, I will accept that. That's okay. Lewis once bemoaned the fact that we were no longer telling good stories to children. He thought storytelling to children was a great way of instilling virtues. In White's Once and Future Tea, you see virtues taught to Arthur.
Yeah.
In Sir Galahad, in The Green Knight, we see great virtues of Galahad. What are some of the virtues that you hope that we will see and learn from your work?
Okay, thank you for that. So I'm very conscious of that. I know that passage, and I'm beginning, as Aristotle says you should, in medias res, in the midst of things. So I'm starting about 2/3 of the way through the thing with the Galahad. By the time Galahad shows up, Merlin is off the scene. This is the beginning of the end, in a sense, of the Round Table. But in the next book, Volume 2, we go back to the beginning, and we have the upbringing of Arthur. And I take some leaves out of T.H. White's book, but others as well. And I'm very, very much in that book, but to some degree in this one as well, concerned with the formation of character in my readers. And I mean, unashamedly so. I have unashamedly ethical designs on you. I want to nurture and exemplify the virtues that without which life becomes intolerable for people, and the development of character, particularly the character of a man. I think there's been I tell you one thing that both astonishes me, but also points me in a direction. I'm not, I have this YouTube, which I meant to do for just a couple of dozen students for a month or so, and then when somebody came up to me one day and said, "Oh, I see your YouTube's blown up." I said, "Oh dear, how do I fix it?" I had no idea what blown up meant. Anyway, so it now has a very considerable reach, and one or two of them have had over 1 million views, but somebody showed me the other day how to look at these stats. And I don't know, this is weird, because I'm a paunchy old guy, right? So 97% of the 160,000 subscribers to my channel, or the other viewers, are men between the age of 18 and 35. Yeah? And a lot of them are younger than that. So there's something happening here there, and I'm kind of God's alternative to the Tate brothers. But the fact is that I think young men are wanting to know, how can I do this thing? How will I grow? And for whatever reason, this paunchy, pipe smoking old guy, is the granddad or the dad that they were looking for. And they tune in, every week. And those are the guys I'm writing for. I'm not just writing, but I'm very, very interested in this question of how character is formed. And there's a passage, particularly in volume 2, where Merlin changes himself and Arthur into owls, and they fly up to this high tower, this stargazing tower. They become human again, and ostensibly Merlin is teaching Arthur both about the outer world, the microcosmos, but then about the inner world. And the heart of that passage is he shows Arthur how to find the pole star, how to find the true North Star, and shows him how that stays there while the rest of the heavens revolve around it. And that wherever he is, or whatever time of night and day, he can find the pole star and get some sense of where he is and what his direction should be. And then, of course, Merlin says, there is a pole star within. All of this is within. You need to find that pole star, and you need to look at it, and you need to check with it, the inner voice of your conscience. So there's, as I say, there is unashamed moral formation, but it also comes with flying owls and magic, so it's kind of,
You mentioned in response to the question about AI, that it was about heart connecting to heart.
yeah. AI isn't, but we are.
Yeah, but our goal is to write heart connecting to heart. So, what advice would you give so my daughter is a young writer. She's 15 years old, and that's something that she's expressed to me is I want to write something important. I want to write something that makes someone else feel something.
Yeah.
So writing with that connection in mind, what advice would you give a young writer?
Right. Ken, how long have you got? So I think this is a really important distinction to be made. Heart speaketh unto heart. Another way of putting that is to quote the Psalms, deep calleth unto deep. Abyssus abyssum invocat. Wonderful. So she's got to learn to write from her depths, and then find the images in the poem that are capable of carrying that weight or that depth. They have to be good images. But, and this is a really important distinction, heart speaking unto heart is not the same thing as my reading this poem to you as my therapy. It doesn't have to be confessional. It doesn't have to be all my unprocessed stuff. I mean, my unprocessed stuff may be really important, and I may need to process it in my journal. But when I get to a poem that I want to share with someone else, I have to go from this particular to the universal. There has to be something in me that I've noticed, which I've noticed because of a depth in me, but which is then communicable to the other person. And I don't have to explain it to them. Do you know what I mean? Now, how do you do that? Well, you do it, I think, by loving and reading lots of poetry. You do it by following Shakespeare's advice, where he says, imagination bodies forth the form of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. So finding something particular, local, nameable, which can then become the symbol, is really important. But let me give you an example. Sometimes I write a poem out of a very specific occasion, right? This thing happened and I wrote a poem personally for my friend about it. Now, normally I don't publish those. They're not necessarily keepers. I send them privately to the person who needs them, right? But every so often I write something which I think was just personal. But it turns out when other people see it, it made that connection. And I didn't know. So, I'll do a very quick example. I was in a situation once where I wanted to go with my dad to the funeral of his friend, because my dad also had cancer, as his friend did. My dad and I were sensing in a very British, unspoken, understated way that this was sort of about him as well. I really wanted to be there with him. And at the last minute, before we went to the funeral, I was called away to my college to deal with an emergency. So I couldn't do it. And as I was looking back, my friend, who was with me and my dad, who was going to go to the funeral too, reached out and held his hand as they were turning around the corner. And she did that beautifully. And I would have loved to have done it, but I wouldn't have done it, of course, because we're English, we wouldn't have done it. But she could do it. So I just thought, oh, it's great. I wish I could have been there, but she did that. So I penned this little poem for her at the end of the day called Holding and Letting Go. And I also made a note of it in my diary. I read it to my wife. She said, can I send this to a friend of mine in Canada? So I still was thinking this is not a publishable poem. A week later, I get an email from Canada, from Vancouver, with the title, Your Hospice Poem. And I'm going, my hospice poem? I have no hospice poem. I've never, what is this? And then I realized that it's this poem. So now I'll tell you the poem. And you can imagine me rereading my own poem that I thought I got, that I thought was just about this one little thing, and how the one little thing that I noticed became universal. So the poem goes like this. It's called Holding and Letting Go. It goes, we have a call to live, and oh, a common call to die. I watched you and my father go to bid a friend goodbye. I watched you hold my father's hand. How could it not be so? The gentleness of holding on helps in the letting go. For when we feel our frailty, how can we not respond and reach to hold another's hand and feel the common bond? For then we touch the heights above and every depth below. We touch the very quick of love, holding and letting go. I'm going, this is my hospice poem. Say, be specific, but not ancestral, would be the answer. Thank you. Very interesting questions you're going for here.
Well, how did you get started writing, and what advice would you have for young writers who haven't published yet?
Okay, so my first advice to young writers is to be young readers. I think you become a poet, or become really a poet, only if you love poetry. And the great thing about loving poetry is you can have as many poetic lovers as you like. There's no restriction here. You can have a mad, passionate affair with Joad Manley Hopkins, and then go, that's a bit too much. I'm going to read Thomas Hardy now, and or whatever. I'm tired of these long, splurgy things from Tennyson. I'm just going to spend my time with Emily Dickinson now. But the point is, everyone you really love as a poet, is secretly teaching you. You don't even know what they're teaching you, but what they're doing is they're showing you what's possible. And then you can practice. I would say, remember that the first draft is only for you. Nobody has to see any of this. And well, I began, I had a long apprenticeship, and I shamelessly imitated the poets I loved, not for publication, but to figure out how they did that, like playing music off a record. And what made me feel it was okay to do that? Keats was my first poetic love. Like I was then and still am a wannabe Keats, right? I want that rich, lush sound. So I was reading through all of Keats's works when my total Keats fanboy mode. And he has an early poem, it's not very good, but it's called Lines Written in Imitation of Spenser. That's the actual title of the poem. And he's learning his chops. So I went, okay, so don't be afraid to imitate. Don't publish your imitations, but don't be afraid to imitate. Read lots. And when you've read enough, you find you have your voice. And I think one of the best ways to start writing is to start writing in conversation with another poet. Read a poem that you like and go, yes, but write a reply. And then there's a sense in which all English literature is a reply to earlier English literature. People say, are you afraid of a blank page? I go, what blank page? There's just a long conversation. And I listened to it for long enough to have the temerity to jump in. So that's the first thing. The second thing I'd say, that if I'm asked what gives me confidence, what gives me the temerity to call myself a poet, I'd say, I've said this before, I said, my conviction is that all the words I use are older and wiser than I am. The words know more than I do, right? And be good to the words that come to you, I'll ask for. If some words of a line come, cherish them, write them down, take them for a walk. and look at the piece of paper you write them down on. And if nobody's looking, hold it up and say, have you got any friends? You know, they usually have. They'll start welcoming some other words. And before you know, you've got a party.
Okay, last question. Yeah.
Oh, not too much pressure. Two parts. Do you believe there are new stories, or are all stories retellings of old stories?
Yes, that's right.
And are there new forms of storytelling? In other words, what value TV shows, movies, video games as means of connecting to the divine?
Okay, are there new stories, or are they always the recycling of old stories first? I mean, any retelling of an old story makes it new. So there's a paradox whereby an old story, if it's a really good story, is a continually new story. But it is equally true that a new story, which is totally new for the reader and totally compelling, may still be completely riffing on an old story. And if it's done now, then the reader who read it for the first time will actually be thrilled to discover. So I've been deep in writing the story of Arthur's fostering, right? So Arthur is the super selected child. A strange bearded wizard takes him away to be fostered by this slightly unsympathetic family. And he has this older brother who's like always kind of, annoying him. And he's the runt of the litter, and he doesn't really know who he is. And he doesn't realize that he's deaf for a great destiny. And, he might as well be living in a cupboard under the stairs. Like, it's the entire Harry Potter thing. And, like, she totally took it from that. And I'm not blaming her, if we're going to steal from the best. But now I get great pleasure out of seeing those parallels between, those are, just some details. So I think, yeah, there are lots of echoes of great story in modern story, and Star Wars would be the obvious example. And a lot of people would say, looking at pre-Christian, the great stories of the Iliad and the Odyssey, or Jason and the Argonaut, those themes come up again and again and again in other storytelling. But that's the point. You tell them fresh and they become fresh. As to are there new media, I think what's very interesting that the media thing, it's great. You can certainly tell stories stories are brilliantly told through film and through television, but they're distinct completely from literary stories. Because in the literary stories, the inside of your mind is the director's cut. You are the director. You make the image. And I think it'd be really bad for us if we outsourced our imagination. So some other director gets to pick all the images that act in our head, because I think we need to generate. So I'm putting in, I think there's a uniqueness of literary story. But I think what would be very interesting is I know most people I speak to now, certainly most young people, don't actually read books. They listen to them on audiobooks. And I'm not passing any judgment on that. But I am saying that therefore means that poetry is a pre-literate art. Poetry began before writing. Poetry was poetry precisely because the tribe wanted to remember the great stories. Therefore, they told them in a memorable form with meter and rhyme, and so help people remember them. So I wonder whether, as we move off the page and back into the ear and the tongue, whether we might be on the verge of a whole new era of great oral poetry telling. And in fact, this is designed to be read aloud. I hope people have the book and read it, partly because they will get the joy of Stephen Crotz's great illustrations. But I am, part of the deal, part of the contract is that I'm going to go into a studio and I'm going to read aloud to you every verse of this poem. And in that sense, it'll be, if you want to do this properly, you need a roaring fire, you need glasses of wine and goblets and good foaming ale, you need comfy chairs, you need to set up the speaker where I'm reading and strike a harp, and you need to keep pouring Guinness over the speaker, and it'll be just like an ancient mead hall.
And I'm pretty certain we need a 14-year-old single malt scotch as well. So Thank you, everyone. My name is Sam Funk, and I am a Trinity Forum Board of Trustee member, and I live here in Nashville. I've been involved in Trinity Forum for about 20 years, so it's very near and dear to our heart. My job tonight is just to give thanks, deal with a couple of housekeeping issues, and of course, send you on your way. First, I want to just thank Malcolm for just an incredible presentation. Thank you. Let's give him another round. Our hope is that what you've heard tonight will just be a small taste of conversations to happen in the future, whether it's with friends or family or colleagues. One of the purposes of these is to generate not just the conversation tonight, but the conversations afterwards. And if there's anybody you know that either couldn't be here tonight or you think might be interested in tonight, this will be on our YouTube page in the next week or so. Also on our YouTube page are essentially every event we've had in Nashville and really all the events we've had across the country. Hundreds of hours of free conversations, presentations, discussions. So feel free to share that with people in your lives. For a deeper dive into some of these same ideas and some similar thinkers, we've got Trinity Forum readings available outside the auditorium. And a couple I'll just point out are The Spirit or the Imagination, The Pardoner's Tale, God's Grandeur, and Revelation of Divine Love. We also recommend, if you're interested, to join the Trinity Forum Society. That's a group of folks that invest in what we're doing. And if you become a member of the Trinity Forum Society, you'll get a subscription to our quarterly readings, the ones I just mentioned. You'll get one of those each quarter. You'll also get a daily email entitled What We're Reading. And it's a curated list of articles that are really well done and will point you to some things that are really thought-provoking. You also get a gift membership you could share with somebody else. And as a special benefit tonight, if you join this evening, you'll actually get a copy of Malcolm's book, The Word Within the Words, as well as a signed copy of our winter quarterly reading, which is an excerpt from Malcolm's book, Merlin's Isle and Arthuriad. So, and finally, as we approach our year end, this is a time when a lot of families, ours included, really want to consider where we're going to invest the resources we've been given. And if you like what you've heard tonight, if you like what Trinity Forum is about, I would urge you to consider Trinity in your giving. Trinity exists because of the generosity of so many individuals, many of whom are in this room tonight, but many of whom are spread out all over the country and all over the world. And it's because of that generosity that we're able to do what we do in the way we do it. And so again, I would just encourage you as you approach the year end to really consider a gift to Trinity. And that could include any sort of donation or also a sponsorship. As we noted, several families and individuals and groups have gotten together to sponsor events like this. So if you'd like to know more about it, see me, see Cherie, Gift Thornton, another Trinity board member, and some other Trinity staff who are here. Lastly, I think it's important to end with thanks. I want to give thanks to our sponsors who are listed on the card in your seat. There's also a QR code here so you can learn more about the Trinity Forum Society. Of course, we want to thank St. Paul and MBA. They've been such great partners for all these years. We also want to thank the folks that made this happen. In particular, it's Lelia Scoggin at St. Paul, Langhorne Coleman at MBA. We could not do it without you. And then lastly, thanks to each of you for your presence and participation tonight. Good evening. Thank you.